Ivy Valentine subscribes to Mark Yoon, so should you. Enjoy your treat!
Comparisons are often used in our daily lives to try to make a decision based on something that we actually know, which means that if you're unsure about something, you use the idea of something else to compare it to so you can actually make an informed decision. This happens all the time, but there's that phrase, you don't want to do apples to oranges. It's only apples to apples or oranges to oranges, which means that like things should be considered like, and that's the comparison, right? This happens a lot of time in video games in the wrong way. Like some people will literally group together things that shouldn't be grouped together. I've seen this a ton with SoulCalibur, for example. SoulCalibur constantly gets compared to games like Tekken, games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, like you name it, it's been compared to it, and for lack of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's still just being compared. Now, I don't really understand the comparison between those types of games because SoulCalibur is a very different kind of game in general just because of the fact that it's weapon-based. Not only is it weapon-based, but it's based around a character creation system. It's based around a unique time period that's not often actually talked about in video games. And this is just the settings and the commonplace things, but also the direction and the idea behind the series, everything of that nature is totally almost counter to other modern fighting games. And a lot of people will cling on to the one that they like and compare it a lot. So, for example, when I'm going through comments when we're talking about like a SoulCalibur video, a lot of the top comments that I'll see will be like, well, NetherRealm Studios does this and Mortal Kombat does this. Why doesn't SoulCalibur be more like Mortal Kombat? Why doesn't SoulCalibur be more like Tekken? And as I said in the last video, Tekken's sales usually are aligned pretty similarly with SoulCalibur. It's somewhere usually between the 2.5 to 3 million mark, and which is not, that much more than SoulCalibur. SoulCalibur usually stays in the same like actual regions. And that's why the games are often released in the same years together, because it's like a 1-2 punch. Like Bandai Namco knows that like most people who play SoulCalibur are going to play Tekken and vice versa. It's similar enough with the movement system. I mean, SoulCalibur has its unique 8-way run, which I think is like one of the best movement systems and defense measure in all of fighting games. Maybe only countered to Dead or Alive, possibly, but I still think 8-way run has a head on top of that. But you see what I just did? I just compared two things that aren't like to each other. Dead or Alive is nothing like SoulCalibur, and their movement systems are nothing alike, but I was forced to try to make that analogy in order to compare the two, just to give an idea of somebody who plays Dead or Alive what SoulCalibur's like if they've never experienced it before. So obviously I empathize with that position, and I understand why people make those comparative leaps sometimes, but I don't understand where it goes to such an extreme where they want something to transform into something else. We talked about this a little bit in my last video, but I wanted to overextend and touch on this a little bit more just so like people had a better understanding of where I came from this. I pretty much said at the end that we love SoulCalibur because SoulCalibur is SoulCalibur. It's the same reason why you would like Mortal Kombat, right? Or Tekken, or take your pick. Now, these games should not be compared to each other just on the basis of how different they are. I can understand why somebody would compare something like Blaze Blue to like Guilty Gear, or something like Dragon Ball FighterZ to another like ArcSys project. Usually similar developers, you can actually compare things a lot easier because you know that they're like linked. Somewhere I would like usually make this comparison would be the Injustice series to Mortal Kombat. Same developers, practically the same fighting system, practically the same basis. It's the same game for all intents and purposes. So you can easily compare the two. For example, if you were walking by someone's TV and they were using Sub-Zero versus Raiden in Injustice, you'd just think they're playing Mortal Kombat. It's like not even just the characters, it's the movements, it's everything. That's a good example of what can be compared. SoulCalibur can't be compared to Tekken because it's a totally different thing, and vice versa with Mortal Kombat. But we often forget that SoulCalibur is in a league with the big boys and under the big boys. It's somewhere around there. Like, people will mention 10 million sales and things of that nature, which is like a super lofty goal for a video game to get. Tekken only got there because of the longevity of the project and how long it was supported after which. And it's not like every single Tekken game hits that benchmark. Actually, none of them do. They're all, like I said, more closely aligned with how SoulCalibur is measured. So I actually don't mind comparisons as long as the comparisons are fair and they're actually used properly. So if you're going to compare something, like I said, like Mortal Kombat to Injustice, make sure it's an actual fair comparison. When you're comparing SoulCalibur to another fighting game, they're not even really technically in the same genre, because this is like a weapons-based fighter, not like a sword, like a fist-based fighter. So you'd be talking, this would be more comparatively to something like Samurai Showdown or something, or a Bushido Blade, something akin to that. But when we're talking about like the main actual categories in which we categorize things to be able to compare, SoulCalibur doesn't fit in those same categories that the other ones do. So I always mentioned that SoulCalibur 6 can't be compared to the others because it's an application game. So what exactly is an application game? Well, let's just jump right into that, okay? So after SoulCalibur 5 was released, you can watch the whole video of the bumpy road, the story to SoulCalibur 6 that I actually posted on my video. What had happened is the director that had signed on for SoulCalibur 5 was a different director from SoulCalibur 4, which was a different director from SoulCalibur 3. This is all because like of finances and different companies that were actually putting money into the game to get the games made, such as Lucas Games for 4, Sony for 3, and 5 was completely different funding. So they got a new director to do that team, and a lot of Project Soul was even different from their current iterations in previous games. This director made an attempt. He actually said in interviews that he was trying to make this game like Third Strike. Street Fighter Third Strike was his main inspiration for SoulCalibur 5, which meant a few different things. He wanted to replace the old cast with a newer, younger cast to get new players in, which in theory can be good if done well. This wasn't done properly. They pretty much just like cloned the old characters but made less interesting versions of those characters. So they were pretty much the same in spirit, such as Taki being a Kunoichi, and then like the spirit hunting Kunoichi was pretty much exactly the same but with blonde hair. Like they was the same character but with all the identity stripped away. So people didn't like that. And then he also wanted an esports focus, which meant the story needs to be not non-existent because it was outsourced to CC2 to do the cinematics for that, so they didn't really spend a lot of budget on that. But what they wanted to do is get this in tournaments, get this in front of people, which is, again, is a good idea. If you have this in the zeitgeist of the player base, if the players are playing this in tournaments, people are going to buy it based on what they see and what they like. If they like the gameplay, you all know how that works. So that was his goal and that was his idea. The problem lies with the fact that the community didn't take too well to not only the characters being replaced, but the story was cut by up to 75%. Even some of the modes that were planned for the game were actually stripped, and then Masayama left the project like weeks after the game came out because the sales came back and it was terrible sales, bad reviews, and he left the project. After which they were left with the decision to keep the series ongoing, which included all the DLC that was already planned and marketed for the game, which they ended up canceling, stopping everything that has to do with the game on the game. No more updates, nothing. Just finished it to move on to the next project. At the time, it was hot back in the day, at this particular time period, to do like free-to-play fighting games. Tekken had one. SoulCalibur tried its hand at one. That also didn't fare too well. People aren't fans of like, you know, getting a free version of the game and then having to purchase for every single character, because the cost can get to more than an actual game at that point if you actually do the math on that, prohibiting any sales or anything like that. But after that happened, they actually pretty much disbanded the studio. Like Project Soul went their own separate way. They all went to different projects. A lot of them went to go help on Tekken's team. Others went to different parts and different teams within Bandai Namco. And that was it. SoulCalibur was to be finished. Motohiro Okubo, as we all famously know now, loved the SoulCalibur franchise and wanted to see it get like a good shake. So actually went to Bandai Namco and begged them to actually return to the stage of history. There were a few conceptions that they had, and they presented those conceptions. Bandai Namco agreed under the conditions that they will stop the series now if it didn't reach at least 1 million in sales, which obviously we all know that they did, and they had to reboot the franchise because they wanted to get rid of all that bad stuff that people didn't like from 5. That's basically the reason why they did a reboot, even though it's a soft reboot. We have SoulCalibur 6. We've far surpassed it. The sequel would obviously be greenlit because it met the contingencies that Bandai Namco had set forth. That's why when I say SoulCalibur 6 was an application game, it's because Motohiro Okubo and the new Project Soul was basically sending in an application to Bandai Namco and saying, we want SoulCalibur to come back. And Bandai Namco had to look at this application and say, this game is your test bed. If this fails, it's it. If this succeeds, we'll continue. Did their best to try to keep the spirit of the game completely alive, but the problem that they now are faced with is they did the best they could with what they had, but since the budget was so low, people had a lot of complaints, thinking this game was like a normal SoulCalibur game that's like run-of-the-mill. With way less budget, they weren't able to put a lot on production value, so that's why we got lots of walls of text that weren't even voiced over. That's why we had a lot of reading involved in the game, and there wasn't many cinematics, especially in like the Libra of Souls mode, things like that. But the game was pretty beefy compared to what we had. I mean, if you play Libra of Souls, there's a lot of game locked in there. If you're going to make comparisons about SoulCalibur, please compare it properly. Like, if you want to compare an aspect of it. Don't compare the entire game. Don't say that, like, Mortal Kombat did the story mode like this, so SoulCalibur should do the story mode like this, because then it would just be Mortal Kombat. If you want to talk about comparisons, talk about how they use meter, or what kind of, like, a dedicated block button, or movement speed, or traversal. Talk about the different mechanics of the game, not the art direction or anything that has no control over for that game, because that's what makes the game game. Any all thoughts are always welcome in the comment section down below, and you can also go in the description box to find my Discord, which you can join us over there to talk about anything you want to talk about. And as I always say, guys, I love it. Thank you.
And thank you.